Life has always seemed to me to be something of a long, quiet journey. I'd never been one for sudden ups and downs. In many ways, Emma and I seemed a perfect harmony. We met when we were both still students. Back then, at university, everything seemed so simple and clear. She was a smart, purposeful girl who knew what she wanted from life. I'm a bit lost in search of my place in the world, but next to her, everything became easier. Emma became my rock. The years passed quickly. We gradually grew together, grew stronger as a couple. And when we moved into this small but cozy apartment, I felt like life was finally on the right track. She started working at a company that I thought was her dream job. I could see her joy every time she talked about her job, new projects, and career opportunities. I was happy for her, even a little proud. It's not every day you meet someone so passionate about what they do. My job wasn't standing still either. Although it wasn't as important and prestigious as Emma's, I found peace and stability in it, which was always more important to me. Not everyone can handle the intense race for success, and I never particularly aspired to it. We had our own roles that we accepted without much ado. She was always more active, energetic, absorbed in doing things, and I tried to create coziness in our lives, to do everyday things that helped maintain balance. We developed our own routine. Each day was basically predictable, but that didn't mean it was boring. I enjoyed cooking dinner when Emma came home late. I could spend time reading a book or watching movies while she did her chores. We didn't have much time to just be together, but we didn't see it as a problem. We understood that for her, work was an important part of her life, and I supported her in that. I remember sometimes, especially on weekends, we would take long walks around the city, talking about the future. She dreamed of taking a leadership position, and I never doubted that she would achieve it. At times like these, I caught myself thinking that it was this drive of hers that made her so appealing to me. Emma always knew how to keep me on track, even when I was starting to get lost in my own thoughts. Perhaps it was in that confidence that I didn't notice what might be hiding behind the everyday. We got so caught up in our own things that over time we began to take each other for granted. She was always busy and I was always immersed in my own. And in that ordinariness, I didn't immediately notice the changes. Little things that didn't seem significant at first, like her late work calls. As I said, she often received texts or calls from her bosses after hours. I didn't pay much attention to it. Her career ambitions always seemed to me something worthy of respect. But as the month went on, these calls and messages began to happen more and more frequently. I wasn't worried, because Emma always took the time to explain that it had to do with important projects. She also started spending more time away from home. Work meetings, business dinners all became part of her daily life. I tried not to dwell on it, believing it to be a temporary phenomenon. In the end, I myself was glad that she was so passionate about what she was doing that she found herself in it. When you truly love someone, you tend to support them in their pursuits, even if it means less time spent together. Our evenings were increasingly spent in silence. I'd sit in the living room with a book or turn on some movie, and Emma would often lock herself in her bedroom with her laptop, immersed in her projects. Sometimes she would just disappear into her world, and I respected her space. We didn't always have dinner together, and it didn't bother me. In fact, I was glad she was so successful. But as the days went by, I began to notice slight changes in her behavior. Her short answers to questions, her looks that seemed to avoid mine. There were times when I noticed the slight irritation in her voice when I asked about her work. I wouldn't have focused on it, however, if it weren't for the moments when she would start to get somehow nervous when talking on the phone. The calls seemed to have no end. The phone vibrated on the table, in the kitchen, in the bedroom. But I had gotten used to it being a part of her life. Whenever it rang, there was one word on the screen: work. The first few times I didn't even notice it, assuming she was just absorbed in her work. Her boss or coworkers could probably call at any time of the day. Then one day, when she had gone to shower after a particularly long day, her phone rang again. I casually glanced at the screen and saw it again read, work. Nothing new. She always said it was a busy time in her department. Probably something urgent, I thought. I wasn't going to answer it. To be honest, it even seemed odd. But when the call came back for the second time in a row, I felt slightly alarmed. Could it really be something urgent? Maybe she needed help? I hesitated for a long time. but eventually picked up the phone and answered. Let's continue, and I'll follow your instructions, developing the story gradually and adding more details to create the right atmosphere. When I brought the phone to my ear, only a brief silence was heard from the other side. For a split second, I wondered if I should have answered at all. But before I could say anything, there was a voice. A low, masculine voice with a distinctly informal tone that caught my eye instantly. "Emma?" he asked. The voice sounded like the man was sure he was talking to her. Not a coworker, not a boss, not a subordinate. Just her, Emma. I could be wrong, of course, but something in his tone made me tense. "It's not Emma," I answered, restrained, trying to stay calm. "Who is it?" There was silence on the line for a moment, as if the person on the other end of the line was trying to process what he'd heard. Suddenly, I heard the connection cut off. He just hung up. No explanation, no questions. Just a short beep of a completed call. I froze. The phone was still in my hand, and I couldn't take my eyes off the screen. What was that? Who was this man? And why had he ended the call so quickly, barely realizing it wasn't Emma on the other end? My thoughts began to jump frantically from one thing to another, but nothing coherent was coming together. When Emma returned from her shower, I sat on the couch as if nothing had happened. The phone was lying where it had been. I wanted to tell her about the call, but changed my mind at the last minute. What was I supposed to ask? Who called you? Was it a man? But maybe I was worried for nothing. Maybe it was a coworker and he just didn't expect someone else to pick up the phone. Either way, I saw no cause for alarm. Emma looked as normal as ever. She sat down next to me, opening her laptop and started checking her email as if nothing had happened. As I watched her, something inside clicked. I had never doubted her before. We'd been together for so many years and we'd always had trust, hadn't we? I remember trying to distract myself from my thoughts that evening. Emma and I were talking about nothing, about how her day was going. She was telling me that their project was almost in its final stages, and it required more meetings and negotiations with management. It all sounded so mundane that I felt stupid for a second. Maybe I was just winding myself up. But then, why did the feeling that something was wrong never left me? Why did that voice on the phone seem strange to me, like it had nothing to do with her work? I wanted to ask her who it was, but I held back. I didn't want to seem jealous or suspicious. After all, I'd always prided myself on the fact that we were frank with each other. And what could I say to her? Emma, some stranger called me, but he didn't say who he was. I tossed and turned long into the night, unable to sleep. My head was full of thoughts about that call. What if it was something important? But why didn't he call back? Maybe he just got the wrong number. But then why did he expect Emma to be on the other end? I tried to convince myself that it was just a misunderstanding, but the thoughts wouldn't let me go. The next few days passed in a familiar routine. Emma was still immersed in her work. I tried to distract myself from my suspicions by minding my own business. We had dinner together, discussed plans for the weekend, and I almost believed that this strange incident could be forgotten. But every time her phone rang, I involuntarily started to get goosebumps. I began to notice that she was leaving the room more and more often to talk. This wasn't the case before. She could easily answer the phone in front of me without paying attention. But now, every time her phone vibrated, she'd pick it up and go into the kitchen or another room. And all the while, I sat there pretending not to notice. Perhaps one of the strangest details was that Emma started staying late at work more often. It used to happen, but not as often as it did now. She said it had to do with important projects and meetings, and I wanted to believe her. I did believe her. But every time she was late, it raised more and more questions in me. Why was her work suddenly taking up so much time? And more importantly, why was she talking less about what was going on in the office? We used to be able to talk for hours about her coworkers, how the meetings were going, the little dramas and conflicts. But now her stories have become dry, one syllable. At one of these meetings, she came home later than usual. I had already gone to bed, but I couldn't sleep. As soon as she entered the bedroom, I felt a strange tension. Emma looked tired, but not the kind of tiredness that comes from a long day at work, but some strange inner anxiety. "Is everything okay?" I asked, rising up on my elbows. "Yes, of course." she replied with a smile, but her eyes didn't meet mine. It was just a long day. She quickly changed her clothes and lay down next to me, but I noticed that she barely touched me when she went to bed, and it was strange. We had always been very close, and she had never avoided my touch before. It's a small thing, but it's details like this that make you wonder. I tried to ignore it, but every day these little things started to add up more and more into some kind of picture that I couldn't ignore. A few weeks passed. Outwardly, everything was still the same. Emma still came in late, still worked late, and was still absorbed in her own affairs. But now I was observing her more. I began to notice how often she checked her phone, how sometimes her face changed when she read messages. I realized that something was going on in her life, and that something was probably not work-related. One night, while we were out to dinner, her phone rang again. It was another call from work. She picked it up, as usual, and said she needed to talk, then went into the kitchen. I remained sitting at the table, trying not to think about what had just happened. But in that moment, something inside me broke. For the first time in a long time, I felt that maybe this call wasn't work-related. Maybe it was something more. Something I didn't know about, or something she didn't want me to know. After that dinner, something inside me changed. I began to notice things that hadn't seemed to matter before. The looks, the movements, the words. Everything began to seem more meaningful. Maybe it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something between us was beginning to blur. Our conversations were no longer as deep and casual as they used to be. Emma often seemed distracted, as if her thoughts were somewhere far away, and every time she came home late from work, it began to worry me more and more. I remember one day she stayed out particularly late. I was sitting in the living room, tucked into a book, but hardly reading anything. All I could think about was that she still wasn't home. The clock on the wall showed 11, then 12, and she was still gone. I began to worry. Sure, there could have been many reasons for the delay, but she always warned me if she planned to stay in the office late. But this time, there were no messages. As the hands of the clock approached 1 o'clock in the morning, I heard the door open. I got up from the couch, feeling a mixture of relief and slight anxiety. Emma entered the apartment. Her face was tired, but I thought there was a slight smile on her lips. It was strange. The smile disappeared as soon as she saw me. "You're so late," I started, trying to speak as calmly as possible. "Yes," she answered briefly, taking off her coat. "Work." She always said it in one word. Work. As if that explanation was all I needed to know. But that night I felt like it wasn't enough. I wanted to ask her why she hadn't warned me, why she hadn't texted me that she was running late. But instead I just silently watched her walk to the bedroom. She looked like someone who was tired not only physically but emotionally as well. I felt like an invisible wall had come up between us. The next day, I tried to force myself back into a routine. I told myself that I needed to trust her more. After all, she never gave me any reason to doubt her. But the more I tried to reassure myself, the stronger the feeling of something slipping away became. Our conversations became less intense. We laughed together less often, shared our thoughts and experiences less often. I even began to notice that she avoided discussing her work stuff, which used to be unusual for her. She always told me about every new project, every accomplishment at work. Now, her answers were short, almost indifferent. A week passed, and I couldn't get rid of the thought of that strange phone call. That voice, that tone, they haunted me. All sorts of guesses popped into my head. Maybe it was a coworker who just got the wrong number? Or was it a friend of hers whom I never knew? But then why did he hang up so quickly? Why didn't he introduce himself? As each day passed, I drifted further and further into my own thoughts, and these thoughts began to plague me. One evening, I decided to have a frank conversation with Emma. We sat at dinner as usual, discussing our day. I noticed her twirling her fork nervously, which was unusual for her. Usually she was calm and confident, but lately her demeanor had become more withdrawn. "Emma, you've changed," I said, choosing my words carefully. "We've been talking less. You don't talk about work as much." She looked up at me, and I could see something new in her gaze, something I'd never seen before. Not coldness, but alienation. It was the moment when I realized we weren't on the same page anymore. "It's okay," she replied, shrugging slightly. "It's just a lot to do. The project's in its final stages, that's all." "I understand, but you've become distant. We hardly talk. You're busy all the time. I'm just worried about you." I looked at her, hoping she'd open up, say something more than the standard phrases about work. But her face remained calm, unemotional. "You don't have to worry," she said softly. "It's just temporary. When the project is over, everything will go back to normal." Her words sounded so confident that I began to believe that it could really be that simple, but something inside me kept moving. Maybe it was an intuitive feeling that not everything was as it seemed. Maybe it was the phone call that kept me on my toes. The next day, when Emma left for work, I noticed her phone was left on the nightstand. She rarely left it at home, but this time she probably just forgot it. I walked over to the nightstand, looking at that small screen as if it could answer all my questions. An urge flared inside me to peek at its contents, but I fought the urge. This was wrong. I'd never invaded her personal space before, and even the thought of doing so now felt like a betrayal. But on the other hand, wasn't she the one who'd made me start to doubt? Wasn't it her strange behavior and those phone calls in the evenings that instilled those suspicions in me? I struggled with myself for a few minutes, but finally gave in. I picked up my phone and unlocked it. There was nothing unusual inside. The standard apps, messages, and mail. I started scrolling through her correspondences. Nothing suspicious. Everything looked the way it was supposed to look. But when I opened her recent calls, my heart pounded harder. The call I'd taken when Emma was in the shower still bothered me, but there was no way I could figure out what was behind it. The name work seemed normal, as it should for coworkers, but something in the man's voice alarmed me. The tone was too informal, and it kept me uneasy. I couldn't jump to any conclusions, though, because the number could have belonged to anyone in her company, a secretary, a coworker, or even someone on her team. It was a perfectly logical explanation. All I knew was that something was wrong. But who was on the other end of the phone? And why had that person hung up without explaining himself? I closed the phone and put it back down, trying not to jump to conclusions. Maybe I really am getting too worked up. When Emma came home that night, I sat in the kitchen, trying to figure out how best to proceed. She walked in with a smile as usual, but it seemed to me that her smile was more strained than before. Or maybe it was just my suspicions starting to take over. Either way, I realized there was something going on in her life that she wasn't telling me. But I had no real proof, and I didn't know how to ask her about it without making her feel like I was jealous or suspecting her without reason. It had been a few days since that strange phone call, and I still couldn't completely let go of my doubts. Even though I tried to focus on work and my daily routine, my thoughts kept returning to Emma and her sudden detachment. I didn't know what to do with this feeling, how to deal with it. My relationship with Emma had always been something reliable, something I could rely on in my life. And now there was a crack between us, and I didn't understand how it had come about. In the evening, I thought about how things had once been very different. We talked a lot, shared our plans and dreams. I remembered how we discussed our trips, movies, books. We always had a lot to talk about, and I could sit with her for hours, enjoying her company. But now I could feel that connection slowly slipping away. Emma came home later than usual. I had already started cooking dinner when she entered the apartment, tiredly taking off her coat. We exchanged a few phrases, but her answers were brief and inexpressive, as if she was just responding out of inertia. At that moment, I realized that this routine superficiality was killing our intimacy. I didn't know how to bring back the ease we used to have, but I knew it was impossible to continue like this any longer. The next day, I decided to change our usual evening. I suggested we have dinner together at a restaurant we had wanted to go to for a long time. Emma was surprised by my suggestion, but agreed. I thought there was a slight spark in her eyes, like when we first started dating. We chose a place in the center of town, where a small table by the window was waiting for us. The atmosphere there was warm and relaxed, and I hoped it would help us take our minds off the daily grind. As we sat at the table and ordered our wine, I noticed Emma relaxed. She was smiling more than usual, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like things were getting back to normal between us. We talked about our first meetings, reminisced about shared trips, and laughed at old jokes. It seemed like things could get good again, that this night could be the start of something new. But as soon as we left the restaurant, I felt Emma pulling away again. Her face turned serious. She checked her phone and quickly hid it in her pocket, like she didn't want me to see what was on it. I tried to ignore it, but something inside me snapped. That evening, back at home, I tried to strike up a conversation about her work. I wanted to ask if she was too tired, if there was anything I could do to help or support her. But she responded with the same standard answer I'd heard before. "It's okay, it's just a lot to do." It just didn't feel right anymore. And the more she said these things, the stronger the feeling that she was hiding something. In the days that followed, I didn't know what to do. Do I speak up? Wait for her to explain things herself? But Emma didn't explain anything. She continued to live at her own pace, and I at mine. Every night she came home tired, and each time I felt us drifting further apart. Then one day, I decided to look at her phone again. I didn't feel like doing it, but I couldn't ignore my doubts anymore. When she went to the bathroom, I picked up her phone, intending to just make sure it was just my paranoia. Opening the call log, I saw the same number again, work. But now it wasn't the mere presence of that contact that alarmed me. It was the timing of the calls. One of them had been made at 11:30 p.m. the day before, at a time when she said she was busy with some project. Why would she be getting calls that late? Yes, I knew her work sometimes required extra time, but such a late call raised doubts in me. I put the phone away, trying to sort out my feelings. I didn't want to be the kind of person who looked for a catch where there probably wasn't one. But I couldn't just turn a blind eye anymore. That night, I decided that something had to be done. Either I would talk to her directly, or I would continue to torture myself with speculation. My patience was running out. We'd avoided this conversation for too long, and I couldn't wait any longer. Anxiety was building inside of me, and I knew that something had to change soon. After that evening, I felt that I could no longer sit idly by. My suspicions grew stronger and stronger, and I realized that if I did nothing, this feeling would begin to destroy me from the inside. But at the same time, I was afraid of ruining what Emma and I still had left. I didn't want to accuse her based on nothing more than my hunches. After all, I might just be wrong. But it was no longer possible to put off the conversation. A few days passed, and all the while I was trying to find the right moment to talk to Emma. I felt like just asking her frankly about everything would solve the situation. But every time I was ready to start talking, I was stopped by some inner anxiety. I was afraid of hearing something I didn't want to know. So one evening, as we sat in the kitchen after dinner, I decided that we couldn't go any further. Emma was engrossed in her phone as usual, checking messages or perhaps work email. I sat across from her, feeling the tension between us growing by the day. "Emma," I began, trying to keep my voice calm, "can we talk?" She looked up from the phone and looked at me with a slight smile. "Sure," she answered, but her voice was somehow wary. She must have realized that this wasn't going to be an easy conversation. I sighed, gathering my thoughts. "I want to ask you something. Have you noticed that we've been talking less lately?" I started, trying not to sound accusatory. "I feel like you've been distant. You're busy all the time, and that's normal. You have a lot of work to do. But I feel like something's changed between us." Emma tensed slightly, but tried to remain calm. "What are you talking about? Same old? Same old?" she answered. But her voice shook, and I sensed she was trying to hide something. "The same as always?" I repeated, trying to stay calm, but something was boiling inside me. "But is it normal for you to be back so late every day? We used to talk more, share things with each other. Now, I don't understand what's going on." She looked at me in silence, not knowing what to say. I decided to continue. "I feel like you're drifting away, and I can't help but notice it. You're always busy. You rarely talk about what's going on at work. And the phone calls. Who's calling you under the name work? I don't mean to sound suspicious, but I've noticed that this number comes up too often, and not always during work hours." I said it slowly, trying not to accuse her directly, but at the same time my words sounded confident enough. Emma was silent, but I noticed her gaze had changed. She no longer looked calm and confident. Her hands twitched nervously, and she clenched the phone in her palms. "Chris, it's just work," she finally answered, but her voice was weak. "You know I have an important project going on right now. Sometimes they call in the evenings because they're discussing urgent matters." "In the evenings?" I questioned, sensing that the subject was hurting her more than she wanted to show. 10, 11 o'clock at night. "Emma, I don't want to blame you, but I find it strange. It's never happened before." Emma pressed her lips together and looked away. "Chris, are you serious? Do you think I'm cheating on you?" she asked, her voice suddenly harsh, as if she were defending herself from an invisible attack. "It's just a job. I don't know where you got those thoughts from." Her answer caught me off guard. I hadn't expected her to go on the defensive so quickly, and it only heightened my suspicions. I sensed that the conversation was stalling, but I needed to clear the air before it ended. "I'm not accusing you," I said, trying to soften my tone. "I just want to understand. I can see that something's changed, and these calls, I don't know what to think. I want to trust you, but you're making me have doubts." Emma sighed heavily and closed her eyes, as if trying to collect her thoughts. "Do you really think I'm cheating on you because I get phone calls in the evenings?" she repeated, but her voice didn't sound as confident as it had before. "That's ridiculous, Chris. You're just imagining things for yourself." I stared at her, not knowing what to say. Deep down, I hoped she was right, that it was all really my imagination. But something in her demeanor told me it wasn't that simple. Our conversation stopped on that note. Emma got up from the table and left for the bedroom, tossing me a farewell. "I need to get some rest." I remained sitting in the kitchen, staring at my empty plate. I couldn't understand what had happened. On the one hand, I didn't want to believe the worst. On the other, her reaction only reinforced my suspicions. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something important. But how could I prove it to myself? The next few days passed in silence. We barely spoke, and every night Emma tried to leave for the bedroom before I did. I could feel the tension growing between us, but I didn't know how to fix it. The conversation I'd started didn't bring resolution to the situation. It only escalated it. Even so, I couldn't back down. I had to find out the truth, whatever it was. One night, when Emma went to bed before me again, I decided it was time to act. I realized that I couldn't go on like this. I picked up her phone, which she had left on the table, and opened the call log again. This time, I saw a new call from the same number that was logged under the name Work. The call was placed at the same time she told me she was going to a meeting with her coworkers. I felt a chill go through me inside. This call confirmed my suspicions again. I couldn't turn a blind eye to it anymore. I knew I had to talk to her again, but now directly. After weeks of doubt and anxiety, I realized I couldn't take it anymore. The moment Emma left for the shower, leaving her phone on the nightstand, something clicked inside me. Time to find out the truth. I picked up her phone and my fingers, trembling with exertion, pressed the last number that had called her. That number was listed as Work. The phone rang, and after a few seconds, a male voice sounded on the other end. "Emma?" he said, and the simple question was friendly enough, but there was no business formality in it. My heart pounded in a way that felt like it was about to burst out of my chest. I clutched the phone in my hand and exhaled. "It's not Emma," I said gruffly. There was a short pause. The man on the other end didn't seem to expect to hear my voice, and before I could continue, he simply hung up. I was pierced by a pain that was impossible to describe. This wasn't just a stranger. This was the man my girlfriend was cheating on me with. Everything I'd been hiding, everything I'd been dreading, was suddenly real. I threw the phone on the table and jumped to my feet. Anger rumbled in my head, making my heart beat at a frantic pace. By the time Emma stepped out of the shower, unsuspecting, I was at my limit. She calmly picked up her phone, but when she saw the missed call, she froze. Her gaze turned cold and wary. But instead of panic, instead of shame, there was only indifference on her face. "Did someone call?" she asked calmly, as if nothing had happened. I did, I said through clenched teeth, her eyebrows raised slightly, but her face remained impassive. Was there something you wanted to know? She asked, looking at me with a slight chuckle, as if it were some insignificant detail. At that moment, everything in me exploded. Who is that bastard? I exclaimed, barely containing myself. Who is this man you're sleeping with, Emma? She didn't even flinch. There wasn't an ounce of regret on her face. The slight grin on her lips only added fuel to the fire. It doesn't matter, she replied calmly, shrugging her shoulders. It's just sex, Chris. Her indifference only fueled my anger. I felt the rage wash over me. I couldn't hold back any longer. Damn it, Emma! I screamed. You're not even trying to apologize. You've spent our whole lives wiping your feet on us. And now you're just saying it's just sex. She looked at me with cold eyes. Yes, she said calmly. It was necessary. You had become boring. You didn't even notice how our relationship had become routine. I just found a way to get what I was missing. Those words felt like they hit me in the face. I felt the world around me crumble. My heart clenched, anger and pain mixed together, becoming a crazy mixture that lashed out. You're pathetic, I shouted, unable to contain myself. You're a fucking pathetic, selfish woman. I trusted you all this time, loved you, and you just fucked some bastard behind my back and you don't care? Emma grinned and shrugged. You're over-dramatizing it, Chris. It was just a way to unwind. Do you seriously think I was going to stay with you when you're not even trying to be interesting? I froze, not believing my ears. She said it with such equanimity, as if she didn't care at all. All I felt was like I was being trampled on like dirt underfoot. Get out, I shouted at her, pointing at the door. Get out to your lover, you're nothing. She looked at me with a slight chuckle, not saying a word. Calmly, she gathered her things, as if what was happening was no big deal to her, as if she was just going for a walk. As she headed for the door, I felt everything inside of me tearing up in pain. I wanted to scream, to punch, to tear everything around me, but I stood there unmoving, gripped by anger and despair. Emma stopped at the door and looked back at me and said, Don't take it so personally, Chris. You've just become too predictable. I found something new, that's all. With those words, she left, slamming the door behind her. I was empty inside. Only my thoughts and pain remained in that silence. Emma was gone, and with her, a part of me was gone. After the door slammed shut behind Emma, it was like everything inside of me froze. I stood in the living room, staring at the empty door behind which the woman I shared my life with had just left. She left as if nothing had happened, leaving behind a void. I should have been relieved, but instead something much heavier and more painful came over me. My first reaction was anger, burning and all-consuming. I replayed her cold words over and over in my head. It's just sex. How could she say that so calmly? I loved her, trusted her, and she just brushed it off like our relationship meant nothing. That anger raged inside me, tearing me apart, but slowly it began to fade, giving way to something much heavier, pain. It came in a wave as I realized that Emma was truly gone, and that I would no longer be able to get back the moments we had. She hadn't just betrayed me physically. She'd destroyed everything that held us together. All this time, I believed in us, that we had a future. But now, it was all a lie. I sat on the couch trying to collect my thoughts, but the more I thought, the more the sense of loss came over me. Our shared memories came back to me one by one. How we'd laughed, how we'd gone to the movies together, how we'd dreamed of the future. And all those moments now seemed distant and fake, like it was all just an illusion I'd made up for myself. I tried to distract myself by picking up the TV remote and turning on a random channel. The screen lit up and some program started, but I couldn't concentrate. One thought kept running through my mind. Why did she do that? Why didn't she tell me sooner? Why didn't she explain how she felt? Maybe then we would have had a chance to save our relationship. But now it was too late. Bitterness and resentment came over me. I remembered her indifference with which she had confessed to cheating on me, and that picture made me angry all over again. I clenched my fists, feeling the anger and pain mix to form chaos in my head. Damn it! I shouted. tossing the remote onto the couch. It didn't help. The pain didn't go away. It stayed inside, growing like an ulcer. I didn't know how to deal with the feeling. Never in my life had I felt such humiliation and despair. I got up and started wandering around the apartment, unable to find a place to go. Every corner reminded me of her, of us, of what had been, but what would no longer be. The table where we sat discussing the future, our shared goals, our dreams. The shelves we picked out together for the living room. Even the chair where she liked to read books in the evenings. It was all unbearable. The apartment seemed empty, and so did I. I opened the refrigerator, took out a bottle of beer, and drank it down, hoping it would dull the pain. But the alcohol didn't bring relief, only increased the feeling of hopelessness. I took a second bottle, trying to convince myself that it would help, but I knew it was a lie. The clock on the wall was ticking, but time seemed to have stopped. Unanswered questions kept flashing through my mind. How could she? That question hung in the air like a sentence, but no one could answer it. I felt cheated and betrayed. Everything inside was tearing to pieces, but I couldn't even cry. The tears wouldn't come, leaving me alone with the deafening pain. I sat on the couch again, staring into the emptiness in front of me. Hours passed, but it felt like an eternity. My thoughts returned again and again to the moment I'd heard her indifferent voice. It's just sex. Those words cut to the heart. She didn't even try to justify herself or apologize. It didn't matter to her. And that's what killed me the most. I caught myself starting to run through revenge scenarios in my head. I wanted her to feel the same pain I was feeling right now, to have her world fall apart too. But then I realized that even that wouldn't give me peace. It wouldn't change anything. She was gone, and now I had to live with that. She would probably go on with her life without looking back, and I would stay here, in this void, trying to pick myself up from the pieces. The night came suddenly. I didn't notice how dark it was, but instead of going to bed, I continued to sit there, staring meaninglessly into the void. I couldn't bring myself to lie down. Going to bed meant facing another reality. This night, I would be alone. For the first time in a long time, I would have to sleep without her. Her presence used to bring me peace, but now even the thought of her scent on my pillow made me cringe. She had betrayed me, and I couldn't forgive that. I got up and walked out onto the balcony. The cool night air was a little refreshing, but it didn't take away the weight that hung over me. The city was quiet, with lights on in the windows of the neighboring houses, but I didn't feel like I was part of this world. It was as if I had fallen out of reality. All that was left was pain, and I didn't know how to deal with it. Back at the apartment, I decided to lie down on the couch. I couldn't bring myself to lie in the bed where I woke up with her every morning. The bed seemed too personal, too soaked in memories that now only hurt. Lying on the couch, I tried to distract myself, but the thoughts wouldn't let go. All sorts of moments from our lives came to mind. I remembered our time together in the kitchen, cooking dinner and laughing. How we walked in the park holding hands. At that moment, it seemed that we were invincible, that nothing would ever separate us. But now all that was shattered. The more I tried to banish those thoughts, the more they came back. I felt something heavy and cold sink into my chest, and it kept me from breathing. There was an emptiness inside me that I couldn't fill. A few days passed, but the pain didn't recede. I could no longer hide it from myself. Every day was like the previous one, an endless reminder of what I had lost. I couldn't sleep, couldn't eat properly. Everything reminded me of her. Even simple things like the smell of her favorite coffee in the kitchen or the plaid she used in the evenings caused a sharp pain. I tried to come back to life, but I realized that this wound wouldn't heal for a long time. I didn't know how to deal with this feeling, how to continue living after someone you loved had betrayed you in the worst possible way. There was an unbearable pain inside me from which there was no escape. It had been weeks since Emma had left, but the pain didn't let up. Every day was a struggle with myself, with loneliness, with a betrayal I couldn't quite make sense of. There was an emptiness inside me that nothing could fill. I tried to live as before, but every little thing in the house reminded me of her. The room smelled of her perfume, her clothes hung in the closet, and all this kept me awake. I often caught myself thinking I was just going in circles. The TV off, the refrigerator with uneaten food, the half-empty glasses on the table, all this routine seemed meaningless to me now. My existence had lost all meaning. I tried to forget about her, but her ghost followed me everywhere. Memories of her cold confession kept reappearing in my mind, reminding me that I would never be able to forgive her, and that I would never be able to return to normalcy. I started going out less. My world narrowed to the walls of my apartment, where I was alone with my thoughts. Sometimes I would sit on the couch for hours, staring at one point, as if frozen in time. Every sound outside seemed distant and inconsequential to me. Even ordinary things like the noise of passing cars or the voices of neighbors no longer moved me. Sometimes I tried to distract myself. I turned on the TV, surfed the internet, read the news, but it was all a waste of time. Nothing else brought pleasure or even the slightest sense of meaning. Something dark and heavy had settled inside me, pulling me down to the bottom. It was as if I were immersed in a thick fog from which there was no escape. One evening, when it was raining outside, I was sitting on the balcony again with a bottle of beer in my hands. I looked at the falling drops and felt the cold air enveloping my body. My mind was spinning with thoughts of how my life might have turned out if Emma hadn't betrayed me. But that thought no longer made me angry or resentful, only a deep, overwhelming weariness. The pain seemed to have become something permanent, like a part of me. I began to realize that it might never go away. The feeling became unbearable for me. I felt that I could no longer live with this heaviness inside. Everything seemed pointless, and every morning when I woke up, I wondered why. Why continue when everything was already ruined? A few days passed and my life continued to move in the same fog. But on that day, something changed. I remember getting up in the morning, looking at myself in the mirror and seeing a person I no longer recognized. The pale face, the droopy eyes, the constant fatigue. I was like a shell of who I used to be. Emma had destroyed me, and I could no longer put myself back together. That day was gray and cold. It was drizzling outside, and the wind was howling outside the windows. I decided to get out of the house, hoping that a walk would help distract me at least a little. I put on my jacket and grabbed an umbrella and slowly walked down the empty city streets. The air was chilly, raindrops falling on my shoulders, but I didn't care. I felt like a stranger in this world. I walked along the road, ignoring the passing cars and the rare passers-by. Thoughts kept running through my head. All I wanted was for the pain to go away, if only for a moment. I was still hoping to find some way to help me get rid of this feeling, but nothing was working. It was like I was trapped in my own mind, where every memory of the past caused me unbearable pain. As I approached the intersection, the rain intensified. I stopped at the crosswalk, waiting for the light to turn green. Water ran down my umbrella. The cold wind ruffled my jacket. At some point I was thinking, so deeply immersed in my thoughts that I didn't notice the traffic light change. The noise of a car snapped me out of that trance, but it was too late. I turned around, and the next moment I saw the car coming straight at me. I didn't even have time to be frightened when a sharp blow knocked the air out of me, and everything around me plunged into darkness. When I woke up, all I felt was pain. At first, I didn't realize what was happening. My body didn't seem to be listening, and my eyes were blurry. I heard distant voices, felt movement around me, but I couldn't focus. I was lying on the asphalt, wet from the rain, and looking up at the gray sky, the sky I had seen for the last time. Is this really the end? A thought flashed through my mind. I could feel something leaving me, as if the life was slowly leaving my body. The voices around me grew quieter and quieter. The lights began to fade. I knew it was the end, but I didn't care about anything anymore. Strangely, at that moment I felt a sense of relief. The pain that I had carried inside me for so long seemed to begin to go away along with my life. I no longer felt anger, resentment, or fear. Everything was getting easier. Everything was getting quieter. Images flashed before my eyes. Childhood, youth, moments with Emma. But those memories didn't hurt now. I let them go. I let her go. All I had left was the silence slowly encompassing me. The world around me was fading away. I felt my entire body sinking into the abyss. And for perhaps the first time in weeks, I felt something akin to peace. I was dying, but there was silence inside me. And maybe that was exactly what I'd been looking for so long. Emma's phone vibrated on the table. She had just gotten home after a long day, tired but still calm. She glanced at the screen and saw an unfamiliar number. Not immediately daring to answer, she picked up the phone and brought it to her ear. "Hello?" The voice was flat, indifferent. "Is this Emma?" The voice on the other end was a weak, trembling woman's voice. Are, are you Emma?" "Yes, I am. Who is it?" she asked without interest. "It's Chris's mother." Her voice suddenly trailed off. There was a short pause. I was calling to let you know. He's gone, Emma. My son. He was hit by a car." Emma listened silently. There was no shock or alarm in her gaze. She stared out the window as if the words on the other end had nothing to do with her. "Chris is dead," the woman repeated, and there were tears, despair in her voice. "You should have been there for him. Where were you, Emma? He suffered so much for you, and now he's gone." But Emma remained silent. Her face remained as cold as ever. She didn't try to justify herself. She didn't try to explain. She didn't need to say anything. All of Chris's mother's accusations seemed distant and unrelated to her. "You killed him," the woman almost whispered. "Do you realize that? He was broken after you betrayed him. If you hadn't abandoned him, he would still be alive. You should have been there for him, and instead you—" Her voice shook with anger and pain, and then turned to sobs again. "How could you do that?" Emma listened quietly, looking at the city outside the window. She felt nothing, no remorse, no guilt. It was all just a distant echo to her, as if it wasn't happening to her. She was tired of the accusations, of other people's emotions no longer touching her. Finally, when Chris's mother's voice turned to a wistful wail, Emma decided it was time to end this conversation. "I'm sorry," she said with as much indifference as if she were discussing the weather. And without waiting for a reply, she hung up the phone on the table, ending the conversation. Silence enveloped the apartment again. Emma walked to the kitchen, poured herself a glass of wine, and sat down on the couch. She didn't think about Chris, didn't remember their life together. It was all in the past, and the past didn't matter. Her future was completely different now. She took a sip and leaned back against the back of the couch. The phone screen flashed again with a message, but Emma didn't pick up the phone again. It was all over.